you had on November 1st, you had a rebellion breaking out among the Ukrainians in Galicia. They took control of several cities or tried to besiege them. The Poles considered some of them as obvious Polish lands. The cities of Przemyśl or Lviv were among them. So the Poles very quickly started mobilizing for fighting against the Ukrainians in that part of the country. In the West, the Poles had their own issues with the Germans. They saw that the German Empire was crumbling, but exactly where the border with the future Poland would go was not known at the time. In the northeast, you had the Lithuanians that had their aspirations. They wanted control of the city of Vilna or Vilnius, which they considered to be their ancient capital city. It had been thoroughly Polonized over the centuries, and there were practically no Lithuanians living within the city of Vilnius itself, or even in the region around it. It was practically a large Polish majority, and still a quite large Jewish minority, but ethnic Lithuanians in that region were very few and far between. And then naturally, the elephant in the room, I guess you could say, relations with a Soviet Russia. Technically, they weren't Soviet yet. It was Bolshevik Russia, but that was where things were heading in. In the East, at that time, you still had German troops. It was those lands. Today we would know them as Ukraine or Belarus. At that time, they were in the hands of the German army that had this military administration over there. However, soon they started retreating from there, and from both sides, you could say, Polish military forces and Bolshevik Red Army Russian military forces started moving in from their own direction. It was certain that sooner or later they would clash and that there would be some form of fight for the borders. It was in this environment that Piłsudski returned to Poland. He arrived by train after having been released from Magdeburg. The Polish Regency Council had applied, you could say, to the Germans. They had asked them to release him. The Germans felt that there was no longer any sense in keeping him imprisoned. It would be better if he could go back to Poland and take the reins. There had been a socialist government formed on November 7th by Ignacy Daszyński. They, at that moment, were the ones that claimed that they had authority in the country. But in reality, there were various regional centers that had taken power in their own hands, so to say, and there was no unified. There was the Regency Council that technically was in authority, in power, but still, it wasn't something that was tangible. It wasn't something that was fully legitimate. Piłsudski arrives at the station here in Warsaw by train at 7:30 in the morning on November 10th. He is greeted by a large delegation from the Regency Council and the top leadership of the Polish military organization. The first day is spent on various talks, negotiations, typical diplomacy. The next day, though, November 11th, is when the Regency Council officially hands over power of the Polish army into his hands. They recognize him as the leader. And the next day, on the 12th day, they give him the authority to form a government. The socialists that had formed their own government on November 7th, they realize that they cannot compete with Piłsudski. They agree, they hand over power as well. But the date of November 11th in the rest of the world, as you mentioned at the start, Armistice Day, here in Poland, Independence Day. And what is fortunate is that the Poles at the time were still in a difficult situation. They had to create one country out of three different administrative areas that had been part of three different empires. You had to take a piece of every area and try to create one whole out of it. But once that important moment in Poland's history arose, they all united forces. When the war was going on with Bolshevik Russia and the Red Army, which really started at the turn of 1918, 1919, when there was some initial communist attempts at taking the city of Vilnius. Later in February 1919, you have the first clashes between the Polish army and the Soviet Red Army in today's Belarus, right on the border of where Belarus and Poland border today. And then naturally in 1920, the big year when first the Poles, they pushed into Kiev, then the Red Army pushed the Poles all the way back from Kiev to Warsaw, and the great Battle of Warsaw took place on the outskirts of the capital city. This was a time of enormous struggle, and if Polish society wouldn't have been united then it would have crumbled under the weight and pressure. The Soviet Red Army marching into Poland, they were expecting to be greeted by the working class with flowers and milk and honey, or bread and salt as it is in Slavic custom. But they were surprised when they saw that the Polish working class went to church. They listened to their local priest, to their bishop, their cardinal in Rome, and they would have none of it. For them, national identity was much more important, and this is what really made Poland's independence possible, because there was a certain struggle that had brought Poland to that moment of November 11th, 1918, but it could only go so far. In November 1918, what changed was now Poland was theoretically and very quickly, realistically, its own independent state, and it could shape its own fate and its own loss. So without this unity, without the ability to rise above, so to say, these internal squirrels, or quarrels rather, this is what makes these nations, that when there is a tough moment, you unite behind the national cause and you fight on. Today, you could say that Ukraine is in a similar moment. They regained independence when the Soviet Union crumbled in 1991. Nevertheless, sure, it was also a struggle that had been going on for centuries, to be honest. Even in the Soviet Union, there was always this effort by some Ukrainian circles to elevate the Ukrainian national independence or Ukrainian culture, because at moments when you can't fight for independence, you can at least fight for the attempt to preserve your own language, to pass it down to your own children. But it wasn't that Ukraine itself made the Soviet Union crumble in 1991. So you could say that independence was in a certain degree, maybe not handed to them, it sounds bad, but it wasn't really that enormous level of national struggle that you need to really...
do with Poland.
Yes.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. Well, look, that's a marvellously positive note on which to end. Can Ukraine, in this war, so maybe this is Ukraine's sort of 1918 moment?
It certainly looks that way. There are many people that make that comparison, and looking at what the Ukrainians have done up until this moment, they are certainly doing all they can.
All they can, and let's hope they are successful. Anyway, thank you very much indeed for that, Adam. There we are, another eventful canter across the course of Polish history from 1918, a seminal moment for many countries, but particularly for Poland. I hope you've enjoyed it as much as we have. Thank you for watching, and we look forward to seeing you next time on Poland Daily History.